There's something profoundly tragic about children who grow up in emotional silence. They don't just become adults who struggle with they become people who've learned to apologize for their own existence. Watch them enter a room and you'll see it. The way they make themselves smaller, quieter, as if taking up space requires permission they were never granted. They achieve something remarkable and their first instinct isn't pride. It's waiting for the moment to pass unnoticed, because that's what feels familiar. That's what feels safe. This isn't about lacking ambition or intelligence. It's about something far deeper. These are people whose earliest blueprint for existence was drawn in the margins, whose foundational belief about themselves was written in the language of absence. What psychologists identify as an internalized neglect schema is really the brain's tragic adaptation. A nervous system that learned to expect nothing, to anticipate dismissal, to treat its own needs as inconveniences. When a child reaches out and finds only air often enough, they eventually stop reaching. They convince themselves that hunger for connection is somehow shameful, that wanting to be seen is asking too much. Picture this. A child in a busy household, standing near the kitchen doorway with a scraped knee or a story from school. They're not screaming or throwing a tantrum. They're simply there, waiting with the patience only children possess, hoping someone will turn around and notice. You've probably witnessed this scene at a family gathering, in a grocery store, maybe in your own childhood memories. The child who doesn't fight for attention, but instead learns to live without it. On the surface, nothing catastrophic seems to be happening. No violence, no screaming, no obvious trauma. But in the architecture of that child's developing mind, something critical is being dismantled brick by brick. Because for a young mind, still learning what it means to exist in relation to others, being overlooked isn't just disappointing. It's existential. It whispers a terrifying question into the foundation of who they're becoming. Do I matter at all? And here's what makes this so insidious. Childhood emotional neglect rarely announces itself with the obvious brutality of abuse. It doesn't leave physical scars or create clear villains. Sometimes, it's just a distracted parent scrolling through their phone. Sometimes, it's exhaustion so complete that there's nothing left to give. Sometimes, it's just the accumulation of small moments, unanswered questions, forgotten promises, eyes that look through you instead of at you. But the psychological impact of these moments, these absences, runs deeper than most people understand. It shapes the lens through which that child will view themselves, others, and the very nature of belonging for decades to come. We tell ourselves that children are remarkably resilient, and in many ways they are. Children adapt to almost anything. But here's the crucial distinction we often miss. Adaptation is not healing. When a child learns that their presence doesn't register, that their emotions don't warrant response, they adapt by developing invisibility as a survival strategy. They learn to need less, express less, expect less. And while this adaptation allows them to navigate their childhood, it often becomes a prison they carry into adulthood, one whose bars they can't even see. Developmental psychology gives us a framework for understanding this. Children require 3 fundamental elements to develop healthily: safety, stimulation, and connection. Remove any one of these pillars and the entire structure weakens. But it's that third element, connection, the experience of being consistently seen, heard, and valued, that most directly shapes a child's understanding of their own worthiness. The pioneering work of John Bowlby in attachment theory revealed something profound. When caregivers respond reliably to a child's bids for connection, they're not just making that child feel good in the moment. They're constructing a psychological foundation, a template that says the world is responsive, relationships are trustworthy, and I am worthy of care. But when those bids for connection meet silence or inconsistency, something darker takes root. The child doesn't just feel sad or frustrated. They begin constructing a belief system around their experience. Perhaps I'm not worth responding to. Perhaps my needs are burdensome. Perhaps I'm fundamentally less important than others. This isn't dramatic interpretation. Neuroscience research shows us that when a child's attempts at emotional connection are repeatedly ignored, their developing brain registers this as a form of threat. Stress, hormones flood their system. Their nervous system begins rewiring itself around the expectation of rejection. What should be their emotional baseline? Security and openness becomes anxiety and guardedness. Yet to an outsider, they might simply appear to be a well-behaved, quiet child. When a child experiences overt mistreatment, the damage is visible and society knows how to name it. But when a child experiences chronic emotional absence, the wounds are invisible, tucked away in the private spaces of their inner world. A child might stop asking their parent about their day because questions go unanswered. They might stop sharing exciting news because enthusiasm is met with distraction. Slowly, imperceptibly, they learn to edit themselves out of their own life. They become emotionally invisible. This is what clinicians call emotional neglect, and it operates differently than its physical counterpart. Physical neglect leaves evidence: missed meals, inadequate clothing, lack of medical care. Emotional neglect leaves no such trail. Its scars live entirely in the interior landscape, in the beliefs people carry about themselves, in the relationships they struggle to build, in the voice that tells them they're too much or not enough or somehow fundamentally flawed. These invisible wounds often don't fully reveal themselves until adulthood, when the ignored child, now grown, tries to pursue intimacy or ambition or joy and finds themselves inexplicably blocked by patterns they don't understand. Consider the adult who consistently downplays their achievements, who responds to compliments with dismissal, who seems incapable of celebrating their own wins. Often, if you trace that pattern back, you'll find a child who learned that pride was pointless because no one was watching anyway. Or think about the person who's terrified of relationships, who keeps everyone at arm's length despite desperately wanting connection. Frequently, that's the adaptation of someone who learned early that reaching out leads to emptiness. Conversely, some become what psychologists call anxiously attached, pursuing approval with an intensity that exhausts them, forever trying to earn the acknowledgement that should have been freely given in childhood. Imagine being 7 years old, bursting through the door after school with a painting you made, colors still wet, pride radiating from every cell. You find your parent and hold it up, waiting for that spark of recognition, that moment of shared joy. But they're on a work call. You try again at dinner, but the conversation flows around you as if you're not there. Eventually, you fold the painting carefully and put it in your drawer, and you don't mention it again. Now multiply this moment by 100, by 1,000, across years of childhood. The lesson being taught is devastating. Your excitement doesn't matter. Your pride is irrelevant. The things that bring you joy are best kept private. Fast forward 20 years. That same person might struggle to share good news with friends. They might minimize their own accomplishments reflexively. They might feel a strange discomfort when attention turns their way, as if they're committing some social transgression by being noticed. The ignored child doesn't just carry wounds. They become adults who ignore themselves, perpetuating internally what was done to them externally. Research validates this pattern. A comprehensive study published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry found that childhood emotional neglect strongly predicts chronic loneliness in adulthood. And here's what's striking. This loneliness persists, regardless of whether the person has an active social life. Someone can be surrounded by friends in a committed relationship, part of a community, and still feel profoundly alone. Because the loneliness isn't about the absence of people, it's about the absence of feeling truly seen. It's critical to understand that most parents who emotionally neglect their children aren't monsters. They're often people struggling under impossible weight, working multiple jobs to keep food on the table, battling their own mental health crises, or simply raised in families where emotional attunement was never modeled. In our current era, there's also the insidious pull of digital distraction. The phone that draws attention away from the child standing right there. The constant stream of notifications that fragment presence into 1,000 pieces. But here's the painful truth that must be spoken. Good intentions don't erase impact. To the child, the absence feels the same whether it stems from cruelty or circumstance. This is precisely why understanding the psychology of the ignored child matters so profoundly. Because awareness creates the possibility of change. Recognition is the first step toward breaking cycles that might otherwise repeat across generations. Ignored children often develop what look like adaptive strengths. Some become fiercely self-reliant, learning to meet their own needs because no one else will. Others channel their hunger for recognition into achievement, becoming high performers driven by the hope that excellence will finally make them visible. Some become expert peacekeepers, developing an uncanny ability to read rooms and smooth conflicts, desperately trying to maintain whatever fragile threads of connection exist. But beneath these apparent strengths often lies a profound exhaustion. The self-reliant child becomes an adult who can't ask for help, who views needing others as weakness. The high achiever becomes trapped in perfectionism, forever chasing a finish line that keeps receding. The peacekeeper becomes unable to advocate for themselves, saying yes when they mean no, prioritizing everyone's comfort above their own. And perhaps most heartbreaking, some children respond to being ignored by simply giving up. They conclude that effort is pointless, that trying only leads to disappointment. This learned helplessness often persists into adulthood as a deep struggle with motivation. A pervasive sense that nothing they do will matter anyway. The particular cruelty of emotional neglect is how difficult it is to articulate. How do you explain what it feels like to be a ghost in your own home? There's no dramatic incident to point to, no clear perpetrator, no physical evidence. Just a pervasive sense that you could disappear and no one would notice. Just the accumulated weight of moments that should have been significant but weren't. And that very lack of a clear narrative often prevents ignored children from seeking help as adults. They minimize their own pain, thinking other people had it worse. Nothing really bad happened to me. But the absence of something essential is itself a profound trauma. It's like asking someone to build a house without a foundation, or expecting a plant to thrive without light. The fact that you survived doesn't mean you weren't harmed. The fact that you adapted doesn't mean you're whole. The long-term consequences are both real and measurable. Research from the National Institute of Mental Health demonstrates that adults who experience childhood emotional neglect face significantly higher risks of anxiety disorders, depression, and difficulties forming secure attachments. Harvard's Center on the Developing Child has shown that consistent emotional responsiveness in childhood strengthens neural pathways associated with emotional regulation and resilience, while neglect fundamentally weakens these same pathways. The science is clear. Acknowledgement isn't some luxury for children who have everything else. It's a developmental necessity, as essential as nutrition or sleep. This doesn't mean every ignored child is destined for a life of struggle. Many grow into remarkably compassionate adults precisely because they understand viscerally what it means to be unseen. They develop a radar for others, pain, a capacity for empathy that runs deep. But their path is often harder, steeper, marked by the need to unlearn beliefs about their own worthiness that were planted before they had any ability to question them. So where does healing begin? Not with suddenly becoming confident or transformed. It begins with something quieter and more radical. Recognition. The simple but revolutionary act of saying to yourself, what I experienced was real. My needs were legitimate. My pain deserves acknowledgement. For the adult who was an ignored child, the first step is often learning to give themselves what they never received. And while that might sound abstract, it can be surprisingly concrete. It might look like pausing to genuinely celebrate your own victories instead of rushing past them. It might mean speaking your feelings aloud, even if you're alone, just to hear them given voice. It might be the practice of reminding yourself against every old instinct that what you think and feel has value. Because the need to be seen doesn't disappear with age. It just goes underground, buried beneath layers of adaptation and resignation. Healing is the process of excavating it, bringing it back into light. Consider how this manifests in adult friendships. The ignored child often becomes a friend who listens with extraordinary attention but struggles to share their own burdens. They show up reliably for others, but rarely ask for reciprocal support. To others, they might appear selfless, admirably low maintenance, but internally, there's often a question that won't quiet. Why don't I deserve the same care I give? This isn't narcissism. It's simply the longing for reciprocity that was never modeled. In romantic relationships, the patterns become even more pronounced. Some adults who are emotionally neglected become what attachment theory calls anxiously attached. They cling to partners with an intensity that can feel suffocating. Terrified of abandonment, hypervigilant to any sign of waning interest. Others swing to the opposite extreme, maintaining emotional distance as a protection, keeping partners at arm's length because closeness has always preceded disappointment. Both responses, though opposite, stem from the same source, the bone-deep expectation that their needs will go unmet, that love is unreliable, that counting on someone is dangerous. Yet, here's a paradox worth noting. The ignored child often becomes one of the most emotionally intelligent adults you'll encounter, because they spent their childhood reading subtle cues, trying to discern when it was safe to speak or wiser to retreat. They developed what psychologists call heightened social cognition. They can read a room instantly, pick up on tensions others miss, sense shifts in emotional atmosphere like changes in barometric pressure. This capacity can be a genuine gift, but it comes at a cost. They're often so attuned to others that they lose track of themselves. So busy reading everyone else's needs that their own remain unexamined. There's another dimension to this that deserves attention. When a child's emotional experiences aren't reflected back to them by attuned caregivers, their sense of self can remain underdeveloped, almost transparent. Psychologists call this mirroring, the process by which children come to know themselves through seeing themselves reflected in their caregivers' responses. When a toddler points excitedly at a bird and the parent mirrors that excitement, the child learns that their joy is real, is valid, is shared. But when a child's emotions meet blankness or distraction repeatedly, they struggle to develop a coherent sense of their own inner life. As adults, they may constantly seek external validation, not out of vanity, but because they never developed a stable internal sense of who they are. They need others to tell them how they're doing, what they're feeling, whether they matter, because they were never given the opportunity to internalize that knowledge. Identity, it turns out, is constructed in relationship. Without adequate mirroring, the self remains somehow incomplete. But here's where the human spirit reveals its remarkable resilience. Even those who grew up in profound emotional neglect carry within them a stubborn spark of hope. That's why so many seek healing as adults. They read psychology books, attend therapy, journal their deepest thoughts, join support groups. They refuse to accept silence as their permanent condition. They want to break it, to speak, to finally be heard. And that desire itself is evidence of tremendous strength. Modern neuroscience offers genuine hope here. The brain isn't fixed. Neuroplasticity means that new experiences can literally rewire old patterns. Every time an adult who was ignored as a child speaks up and is genuinely heard, their brain registers safety. Every boundary they set that gets respected teaches their nervous system that they're worthy of consideration. Every moment of authentic connection becomes like water on stone, gradually wearing away the old grooves of neglect. Healing accumulates in small moments, not dramatic revelations. And healing rarely looks like what we imagine. It's not a sudden transformation. It's the quiet courage of telling a friend, I need you to really listen right now. It's allowing yourself to say, that hurt me, instead of swallowing the pain. It's sitting with yourself and acknowledging my feelings matter, even if no one taught me that. These moments might seem small, but they're revolutionary acts of direct challenges, 2 years of learned silence. None of this is easy. Adults who were ignored as children often fear rejection more than almost anything else. So, speaking up feels like stepping off a cliff. Setting boundaries feels like betrayal. Asking for help feels like exposing some shameful weakness. But doing these things, despite the fear, that's where healing lives. That's how the self slowly repairs. It's also worth acknowledging that parents who ignore their children are often repeating patterns from their own childhoods. They might be overwhelmed by circumstances, lost in depression, or simply unaware of how profoundly their emotional absence impacts their child. This doesn't excuse the harm, but it reminds us that neglect often flows through family trees across generations. When an adult chooses to heal from being ignored, they're not only saving themselves, they're breaking a chain that might stretch back decades, possibly centuries. Think of it this way. Every ignored child who learns to listen to their own needs becomes someone who can truly hear others. Every person who learns to value themselves becomes someone who teaches others that they matter too. Healing doesn't stay contained. It radiates outward, touching relationships, communities, future generations. This brings us to a profound truth. Ignored children often feel like they left no mark on the world, like their existence was somehow but their stories carry immense power. Their journey from invisibility to visibility, from silence to voice, can light the way for others walking similar paths. When they dare to share their truth, they create permission for others to do the same. When they heal, they open doors for others to walk through. So if you were that child, if you remember sitting alone wondering if anyone would notice you were gone, if you learned to make yourself small and quiet and unobtrusive, If you ever questioned whether your existence mattered, I want to say this directly. You mattered then. You matter now. Your presence in this world has value that exists, independent of whether it was acknowledged. Healing isn't about erasing what happened. You can't rewrite your childhood, but you can rewrite the story you tell yourself about what it meant. You can learn to offer yourself the compassion that should have been your birthright. You can begin to see yourself not through the lens of neglect, but through eyes of understanding and care. Being ignored shaped you, left marks, created patterns. But it doesn't define the boundaries of who you can become. The psychology of the ignored child is ultimately a story about absence and presence, about how silence can wound and how breaking that silence can heal. It's about how being unseen can feel like a curse, but can also cultivate a deeper empathy, a fiercer drive to connect, and an unshakable hunger for authenticity. In the end, many children who were ignored grow into adults who refuse to ignore others, and in that choice, messy and imperfect and brave, they discover something they'd stopped believing. They were never truly invisible. They were just waiting for someone to look. And sometimes, they have to become that someone themselves.